Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. I hope you had a wonderful, glorious, and incredibly good week. This is episode 242, season 5, episode 29. We close out the book of Leviticus for the 5th time in Coaching the Bible today. Quite an accomplishment. Episode 242 is titled The Cost of Ignoring the Soul, which is the idea that we're going to talk about today about burnout. Burnout as a subject is something that I have been reading a lot about, not because I'm suffering from it, although I do believe that at some point, probably most of us have suffered some form of burnout. But it's something I've been reading a lot about because in the industry that I spend most of my time in, which is the nonprofit space, working with leaders, working with organizations, you see it on people's faces. You see it in their affect. You see it in how they move. You see it in how they do their work. And it just becomes a question of, is there something to be done for burnout? How do you fix it? How do you mitigate it? How do you avoid it in the first place? What else is going on underneath that? It raises a lot of really powerful questions about how we handle life, how we handle work versus how we handle the rest of our life, that term work-life balance, or how we manage the entire ecosystem of our world or worlds to make it all work and to make it doable, to be successful at it. And so that's our subject for the week, episode 242. Let's start here. The cost of ignoring the soul with this. Let's take someone by the name of Bob. I use the name Bob a lot, but we're going to use Bob today. Bob isn't just good at his job. Bob is the mission. Bob is the founder of a nonprofit that services middle school to high school age children through a mentorship program. Started it from scratch. He got the first donor. He led all the first events. He hired the team. Everyone looked to Bob for all the decisions, for all the strategy, for all the inspiration, all the reassurance. Bob's the first one in, the last one out, and always available. You can always catch Bob with a text message or an email, even late at night. Over the years, Bob began to believe something which Bob would never say out loud. If I rest, everything falls apart. Now, everyone around Bob would call Bob unstoppable. The board would look at Bob and say that Bob is essential. And Bob wore both the idea of being unstoppable and essential, invaluable, as armor. But behind all the praise, Bob had stopped sleeping. Bob had stopped feeling any sort of joy. Bob started to make mistakes, zoning out in meetings, snapping at people, the people that Bob used to mentor with incredible grace. And then one morning came along and Bob couldn't get out of bed, not out of laziness, not out of weakness, but because Bob's soul had gone silent. That day, Bob didn't send any emails. Bob didn't join any calls. Bob didn't apologize either. Bob just lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of having built something that he could no longer carry. Anyone like Bob? Are you yourself like Bob? Could very well be. This episode is about Bob, and it's about every leader who never stops until something inside them does. You might call it burnout. I would call it burnout. I think a lot of people would call it burnout. But what is it, and how do you reclaim that inner joy, that sense of positivity, that good vibe feeling, that purpose, and of course, your soul? And so I want to ask just a few questions here that we can think about in that example about this person named Bob, who's made up. I just use Bob in a lot of different environments, and so this is just another one. Now, Bob could ask himself these questions, but these are questions that I'm going to ask you that I think you should consider as well. When did I start believing that rest was something that I had to earn and not something that I needed? Directionally, you're going to see that our conversation from a biblical standpoint, because we haven't even mentioned the Bible yet, is going to be about the idea of rest, the concept of letting the land lay fallow, not seeding and not planting and not working the land and letting it rest. The 7-year cycle, known in Hebrew as Shemitah, in English is the idea of the fallow land. So number 2 is, what are the things that I'm holding on to right now that no one else can see? Maybe it's that lack of joy. Maybe it's some deep-seated frustration or anger. If I'm the leader, am I looking at my expectation level of everybody else or what it is that I'm trying to attain from a grounded state? Am I being seen if I'm on the team fully, completely, wholly by everybody else? Or am I forgotten? Am I taken for granted? Am I overlooked? And if I truly paused, really took a break, what am I concerned might happen? Both from a practical standpoint, if I'm Bob and maybe my organization is going to fall apart, or if I'm somebody else and I'm concerned that my store's going to close, my business is going to close, my relationships are going to crumble, or from an emotional standpoint, what am I worried about that I will have to confront, that I'll have to think about, that I'll have to deal with if I truly paused and took a break to breathe, to let my soul catch a moment. You see, because in this week's portion, the double portion that finishes out the book of Leviticus that I mentioned for the fifth time here in Coaching the Bible, yes, Bahar B'chukotai, that's the Hebrew, begins with the conversation around letting the land rest. Chapter 25, the Leviticus, for 6 years you shall sow your field, but the seventh year shall be a complete rest for the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. In that seventh year, you don't sow, you don't reap, you let go of control. You don't own it. It's not optional. It's law. It's commandment, because the land isn't actually yours. It belongs to God. In a religious space, it belongs to God. If you want to look at it simply just from the universe or from the earth, you get to live on certain land. Technically speaking, from a legalist perspective in the country where you live, maybe you have title to that land, but I don't think the land thinks you own it. Everything stops. Even the great work of turning that land into orchards and fields and fruits and vegetables and a place for animals to roam and to eat and to feed. We have to leave it. We have to leave it. I mentioned to somebody yesterday, when we think about that concept on a very deep level, we don't own anything. It's illusory to think that we do. Maybe it's comfort or something else that allows us to work and do and accomplish based on the notion that we own something. Not sure that we actually own anything. Then in the second portion, we get all the curses. And it's even mentioned that if the seventh year is ignored, if we don't leave it fallow in the seventh year, if we don't let it rest, we know the consequences. We lose the land. We're punished dramatically. It's not for what we would think of as the most horrifying and terrible commandment violations and sins, but it's because we didn't keep the seventh year. The land will be desolate at that point. There will be no people there to work it. You will lose the right, the gift, the opportunity to have lived on it, and it'll be scattered to the world. It happened. But I don't think we should allow ourselves to simply believe that this is about soil. It's not. It's about souls. It's about reclaiming our soul. It's about reclaiming who we are and what happens to a person, to a team, to a leader when they're pushed beyond what's possible. And when the rhythm of work, of service, of sacrifice never yields to rest. It's less a punishment than a consequence. We talked once about consequences in this exact space, about the blessings and the curses, the punishments as consequences. What happens when a person is pushed beyond their rhythm? Beyond what's possible for themselves, beyond the space where they can't rest, they too become desolate. Use the terms that the Bible uses. They're desolate even if they're still performing, just like Bob. Bob's hollowed out. He is a shadow, a shell of himself, and anyone else like that is teetering on the edge of flaming out completely and of totally losing themselves. It's a scary prospect. But the truth is, we live around and amongst many people who have been hollowed out. They are desolate on the inside for a whole host of reasons. Empty, destroyed even, because we have perhaps given into a certain type of lifestyle and certain type of culture of consistent and constant connectedness. Maybe that's it. Or the idea that we have to earn rest. Maybe it's that. or maybe it's deeper. And so this conversation, this idea about it's not soil, it's souls, and it's about hollowness and reclaiming the sacredness and the sanctity of who we are as human beings is for Bob, the nonprofit guy. It's for the person who runs the store. It's for the community leader, clergy person, or simply just the director of a community. It's for the parent who hasn't sat still in years, the teacher who shows up to the classroom. We can all resonate with this, who shows up to the classroom with a smile, but hasn't felt joy in months. I'm not saying you're that teacher, but I'm saying we've experienced people like this. They could have used a year off or more. Or the manager who says that they're fine. Fine is not a good word. They're fine, but no longer actually remembers what it means to feel like a whole and complete and a real human being. The message here from this portion, from this idea in the Bible, and the message that society is telling us, even though it's not telling us, is you're not more holy, more special, greater when you never stop. You actually become just more breakable. And so you break. Yes, and it's important to work hard, and it's important to accomplish and to continue to do and to push through and to be resilient and all those things. At the same time, it's also important to simply just listen to yourself, to take stock, to take a step back, and to reapply the sanctity and the sacredness that you are losing by constantly going till burnout. But it's also just not the leaders in those spaces. This is really anyone who is driven, always on call, always reachable, always responding. So what happens is that the mind is always in a space of I can't relax. I'm bracing for the next disaster to come my way, or I have to do and I have to respond and I have to answer that email when it comes, and I can't wait until the next day because I'm connected, but maybe connected in all the wrong ways. And so you're checking the emails at 11 to 12 o'clock at night. You're scanning your Slack messages at 11 p.m. You can't sit still because stillness, breathing, resting, calming, now in your mind equals some sort of guilt and creates not what it's meant to, but actually creates anxiety. And over time, this idea of always being on leads to diminished creativity, a diminished level of empathy. The brain is cluttered, emotional flatlining, and utter and absolute complete spiritual disconnection. You're no longer leading from vision. You're leading from habit at best, and you're leading from depletion at worst, but more likely the case. So this is when the leader ignores the soul. This is when we create and combine in cultures that diminish or devalue the humanity of the human for the sake of outcomes and outputs. And so the key leadership principles that are at play here, that are at stake here, are number one, appreciate that rhythm is sacred and not optional. The rhythm of life, the rhythm of the schedule, of the calendar, of the day. It's not meant that you simply have to be circadian in how you do that. But when we have a disrupted and disjointed rhythm in our lives day to day, that is suboptimal. And so it starts to creep in with a skipped meal, a little bit of tension in the chest and in the neck, a little bit of pain in the lower back. The thought of taking a day off leads to mounting and impending levels of guilt. We start to justify it and explain it away. It's just a season. It's just a month. It's just a period of time. Once the event is over, I'm going to go back to normal. But the seventh year, the idea in Hebrew called Shemitah, that's the term, doesn't allow for that thinking. You rest because resting is holiness, not because you're tired. Your rest is ritual. It's not just simply reaction. And the absence of that rhythm isn't neutral, isn't the lack of being neutral. It's actually dangerous. So number one leadership principle is rhythm is sacred, not optional. And we need to figure out ways and learn ways to implement that into our own personal worlds and also to that of the people around us. Number two, leadership principle here is you don't actually own the mission. You steward the mission. You might cultivate the mission. The land, put that in quotes for a moment. The land could be the mission, the land could be anything. The land is mine. Mine in the Bible there, in the English translation, is with a big M because it stands for something related to God. You, says God, are sojourners, you're strangers here, that the land is mine. And that doesn't simply just apply to land. It applies to leadership. It applies to mission, goals, tasks, projects. Too many leaders believe their value is tied to being indispensable, and that if they step away, everything will fall apart. First of all, nobody is indispensable. If you weren't clear on that, I'm saying it again. It's true. No one, absolutely no one, is indispensable. That might be unfortunate to hear, but it's really true. If the mission collapses the moment you stop, then it probably wasn't built sustainably well enough. It was built purely on your exhaustion, and it runs on the fumes of that exhaustion. And so a better version, or a sacred version, or a Bible-based version, I think, is one way to term it. But a better version is the best way to term it, of that kind of leadership means holding the mission, managing the mission, stewarding the mission, but not being crushed by it. And it means that when we're building it, that as much as that it's about success, we've said this before, it's also about succession. It's also about the team, getting the people in place, putting people into spaces where they can succeed, where they can hold it up, where if you disappear for a week, you come back and everything's fine. Now that is good because that means it was built well. It's also bad because it shows, hey man, you're not indispensable. So rule number one was rhythm is sacred. Rule number two is you don't actually own the mission. Rule number three is that if you ignore the soul, you pay the price. That second portion, the last portion of the book of Leviticus, opens with the litany of curses. But as I mentioned before, it's really a list of natural consequences. The world and your world doesn't just punish misuse. It collapses under misuse, or in this case, abuse. And the leaders are part of and part and parcel of, and the builders of systems. And when the system is constantly in what you'll call output mode, not even outcomes, it's just output mode, another email, another task, another meeting, another crisis, another ask, without any input or pause or a chance to breathe or think or settle, the outcome is not only not a lack of success, and it's not just burnout, it's actually hollowness. Your soul's not in it anymore. The Bible is warning against it. It certainly doesn't glorify it. Everyone might still see you putting stuff out there, but you are emptied out on the inside. And so we get that idea, we think about it, we can appreciate it. Perhaps it's important to go a little bit further and appreciate actually what's going on underneath. What is actually happening to us? What is burnout? The psychologist, Dr. Christina Maslach, is a pioneering psychologist who first defined and measured burnout in the 80s. Yes, it's actually a scientifically studied thing. She co-created the Maslach burnout inventory, which I tried to take, but that cost a lot more money than I was willing to spend at the moment. But I think it's worth looking at and understanding how it is. And it's actually built for different industries and different modes of work. It's the most widely used tool for assessing burnout in professionals. And her work on burnout reframed how we think about burnout. And that burnout is actually more of a systemic issue more than it's simply just a personal failure. And it really very much highlights the mismatch between people and their work environments. So burnout, she identified in three key dimensions. Number one, emotional exhaustion. You're still functioning, but you're not feeling it anymore. You're on. The lights are on, but nobody's home. Number two is depersonalization. You begin to distance yourself both emotionally and spiritually from the very people and the work you once cared very much about. You see this often with people who started things who either the work that they're doing is no longer interesting to them, or they want to start something else and they want to move on, and they're stuck and they're tied to this, but they're running on fumes. It's very much a defense mechanism when you move into that depersonalization stage, and it helps you survive mentally and emotionally by depersonalizing and separating yourself from it. And the third area where she focused in is that it has reduced personal accomplishment. Even as you work harder, you still feel like it's not enough. You begin to believe you're not enough. So burnout operates in that space. So you might have more responsibility, you might have more work, you might have higher, greater expectation, both of yourself and hoisted and foisted upon you, but you're not actually not accomplishing more or better because you can't. And the reality of it is that the data tells us that burnout is almost epidemic type of levels. A 2021 study from Gallup showed that 76% of employees experience burnout at least sometime. 76%. And it's much higher in certain specific industries. Nonprofit leaders burn out very quickly. Clergy members also. Even some of the what you might call the happiest people in these spaces, they're actually hollowed out. And these aren't lazy people. They're committed, they're overgivers, they're overachievers in many cases, and they're soul first leaders. They're really giving of who they are, but they're injured. It's not just that they're exhausted. They might be, they may not be exhausted, but it's like they're injured on the inside. And so it's caused not just by the person. It's really not the person, according to Maslach. It's really caused by the environment. So the solution isn't just taking a day off. The term I saw in an article about it was, you can't get rid of burnout by simply just doing yoga one day. It doesn't work. She has an entire framework, which is beyond the scope of today, but I'll maybe add it in the show notes, of how you systematically realign people and workplace to reduce and maybe even eliminate the burnout. So idea number one from a psychological perspective is the idea of exactly understanding how burnout works and how you can realign around it's fixable, realign about getting better and improving in that space. Number two, which might even be a deeper level here, because burnout is often the consequence and it's a result of the lack of consonance between space and person, is the person themselves over functioning. That's the term. That's a term that was, I believe, coined by Dr. Gabor Maté. Dr. Gabor Maté is a Hungarian-Canadian physician and trauma expert who's known for his groundbreaking work on addiction, stress, and child development. And he teaches that many high performers are actually driven by unsolved trauma and not just by ambition. What ends up happening is that it leads to chronic overfunctioning and disconnection as human beings because they're simply just focused on overachieving on the end of that. His core message, very much in terms of his work, is the essence of trauma is disconnection from the self, and healing actually begins with reclaiming authenticity for the self. And so Dr. Maté actually mentions and writes and talks about the idea that leaders are not strong because they want to be. They're strong because they had to be. Because again, it's built on some sort of unresolved trauma. Maybe they were raised in environments where emotions were unsafe, where vulnerability was punished, where love was given based on performance and not simply just for being. And so what happens is that the person becomes a fixer. They carry everything. They never allow for rest or never need, quote unquote, for reassurance. They didn't learn to lead. They learned to survive, and they survive by leading. And when they carry that trauma into adulthood, whether that's as an educator, as a founder, as a clergy member, as a caretaker, the rest that they actually and absolutely need doesn't feel restorative. It feels threatening because they're not accomplishing, they're not doing. And if they only were rewarded for performance or for accomplishment, it's a threat to who they are as a being. And they feel shame as a result. They don't feel any sort of sanctity or sacredness in the space of rest. They feel shame. And he writes, when you suppress your needs long enough, your body will protest in illness what your voice dared not say. And that's what happens when you ignore, quote unquote, Shemitah, leaving the year fallow, leaving the place, the land, an opportunity to rest, not giving it the restorative powers it needs and it deserves. You get this. And then the reality is that the world itself is not punishing us. It's ourselves revolting against ourselves. It's an internal revolution or civil war within the human being that's going on. And so that's deeper. Meaning burnout is what it is. And maybe we understand it, but over functioning is not something we think about or approach or appreciate. And so he has also a system by which one notices how this works, noticing the person. If the person wants to figure out what's going on and get better in that space, they have to notice their signals. We've talked about this in other environments of coaching the Bible. Notice the signals: illness, tension, fatigue. Those are messengers. What are they messaging me about? What are they telling me about? Identifying my own personal patterns around perfectionism, around what he calls compulsive caregiving, around people pleasing. Through the situations and the relationships is whose love did I have to earn? Right? The parental relationship shouldn't be a love that you earn. It should just be. But if you have to earn the respect and the love and the devotion of your parents, let's say as an example, then overfunctioning could be the manner in which you armor up or quote unquote heal in the world that you live in. And so there's a lot of ways to work through this. There's a lot of ideas here. There's a third idea which I simply just don't have time to talk about. Again, maybe it's another conversation or maybe it's in the show notes. It's called The 7 Types of Rest by Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith in her book, Sacred Rest. The idea that burnout isn't just emotional or spiritual, it's sensory, mental, creative, and relational. There's a lot here. There's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot to unravel. And there's a lot to appreciate. And there's a lot, I think, on the other side of that, which is good, which we can do to fix the burnout, to restore the soul and the sanctity and the sacredness of who we are as human beings. Here's the quote from her, which I think is the killer quote right now, since we can't go through everything. Sleep but exhausted, definitely true. We see it. You see it in a lot of people. Rest is not sleep. Rest is the place for restoration. And so because we're so plugged in and we're so distracted, we don't give ourselves the opportunity or the time to restore. We sleep for a few hours, then we go again. She writes that we have forgotten as a society how to be still. We're never actually really off. Even our downtime is to truly disconnect and to be hyper vigilant about it versus being hyper vigilant about the other things which we mentioned before: checking the Slack, checking the email, making that phone call, going to that meeting, running this, doing that, all those other things. The hyper vigilance around the rest, about the restoration, is overload. So we have Dr. Maté's idea of being overfunctioning. We have the idea of burnout, and we have the idea here of overload, sensory overload, all kinds of overload. There's a lot of things going on here in burnout that we are simply just falling into, which leads ultimately to the idea of depletion. So there's a lot to unpack here. And if this is what you're feeling, this is what you're going through, this is what you're experiencing, or you're seeing this in somebody else, you are either doing yourself no favors or someone else, that other person who you care about, no favors by ignoring it. So the Bible, in its idea about letting the land lay fallow, is modeling a behavior of real rest. And it's not some sort of performative pause like a few hours of sleep or a 20-minute meditation when you're actually not meditating and you're really focusing on something else. And so we have to ask ourselves all these questions. And we have to think about it. And we have to figure out, how do we do this? And where do we see this? And how can we make it better? We've seen it in real time with real people. Simone Biles, the world famous champion gymnast, in the last Olympics, right? I think it was, or 2020, whichever year it was in the Olympics, she just stopped. She couldn't do it. She called it what she called the twisties, where the mind and the body were no longer communicating under pressure. She said, I'm still a human being. We're not just athletes. And so she paused. She stopped. She got all kinds of heat and garbage for it because she's a champion and all those other things. But she was honest. She couldn't do it. It's a famous story about Ariana Huffington, that going, nonstop, A1 personality, all that other stuff, high achiever. And then one time finds herself face down on the floor in a pool of blood from her own head because she cracked it on her desk from exhaustion, which led her to have that wake-up call, to reassess everything that was going on in her life, to start a new company that was focused on rest and rhythm and the science of sustainable leadership. Because she broke, because effectively she defied the law that's in the Bible. Again, not in that space, or thinking of it that way, not appreciating that there's a rhythm to life. And so we have to do the inner work here to fix ourselves, to rebuild ourselves, to give ourselves the space to breathe and to have restorative rest and to have the opportunity, perhaps, to lay fallow for a period of time and simply just take the time and not feel guilty about it or shame about it or guilted about it. And so number one, always, and a lot of the spaces in coaching the Bible, is an audit, personal audit for yourself, by yourself. Can you do this? What would happen if I disconnected from what would actually happen? What are you afraid would happen? And then if you have the chance to do it, what actually did happen? Was it worse than you thought? Was it better than you thought? So number one is an audit. You can call it the fallow audit, the Shemitah audit, whatever you want. And then you can talk about a guilt conversation, because the rest often sits on and is triggered by shame. I didn't earn it. I'll fall behind. What will people think? Can you ask yourself the question, where did I learn that rest equals failure? Whose approval am I afraid of losing if I stop for a minute? I take a breather. Can I somehow reframe the conversation around the idea that rest is not the opposite of my responsibilities, but actually is what fuels my responsibilities, my accountability, and my success? And these are all heavy, deep questions for deep and meaningful conversations and important conversations that one can have with themselves, that can have with their coach, can have with the psychologist, can have with their spouse, can have with their partner, can have with their best friend. But here, let's actually do something that's real and practical. If you manage a team or in your own home, design a sacred pause. You can't take a year off. Fine. You can't take 30 days off. Fine. Maybe even a week is super hard. Possible. But if you could define and design 15 minutes a day, nothing's going to happen if you pause for 15 minutes a day. 15 minutes a day, no screens, no doing, just breathe. It's not even a meditation where you have to listen to somebody's voice telling you to deep breathe in for 4 and hold for 4 and out for 4. It's just your daily ritual of 15 minutes. Maybe that's when you have your coffee with nothing else. Maybe you close the lights in your office, in your room, you have a glass of water, you close your eyes, and then you protect that, because the rest isn't leisure. The rest isn't something that you have to earn. The rest is actually holiness. You can actually design something very similar with your team, because the reality is that burnout isn't a badge of honor. It's a sign that your system needs to rest, to model that rest for everybody else, that the system is built as a model for that for everybody else. And if you lead and you lead responsibly and you're leading publicly, then you're leading in a way in which burnout and overfunctioning and overstimulation and all those other things and the guilt and the shame and all that other stuff isn't there. And you're able to create a new rhythm that is a much more holistic and healthy and happy culture for everyone around you. One last thought. The idea of letting it lay fallow for a period of time isn't new here. It's actually already built into the system, and it was built into the system for the week early on in the Bible, in the first portion of the Bible. Because there it talks about the idea that on the seventh day, God rested. And so the idea of rest, restorative rest, isn't limited to the seventh year. It's written into the very fabric of the creation itself. It's the seventh day. The quote unquote creation of the seventh day was that God rested. And so again, you don't have to be religious to take this idea. You can implement a Sabbath for your own life that is not a religious experience per se, but it can be a sacred experience. It can be a holy experience. It can be a restorative experience where you take the connectedness from everyone else in the world and you refocus it on the people that you care about most and yourself. Because we do know that God didn't rest out of fatigue. God wasn't tired on the seventh day. God rested to create and to model the spiritual rhythm that exists in the world, to teach us that sometimes stepping back and stepping away and restoring and breathing is sacred, not just necessary, but sacred and is actually blessed. It's one of the first great leadership acts in all of the Bible is not taking action, but is a cessation from action. It's not weakness, it's divine design. To close it out with a quote and a little blessing, here's our quote from American novelist Anne Lamott. Almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. That's Coaching the Bible for this week. May you lead with strength. May you serve with joy. And may you rest, not as a reward for survival, but as a declaration that your soul was never a machine. Have a good one. Look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.